We have a special guest with us. This is really a nice treat. We often do discuss Jane Austen's works, but today we're going to be able to hear something about the fashion from Jane Austen's time. So I'm going to turn it over now to our moderator, Erin, and you can introduce Hilary for us.
Thanks, Rachel. Hi, everyone, and thanks for logging on and joining us this evening for one of our meetings. Yes, tonight we have a special guest with us. Her name is Hilary Davidson, and she is a dress, textile, and fashion historian and curator. She's also an associate professor and a chair at FIT for the Fashion Textile MFA program. Hilary, thank you for joining us so much this evening.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. Now, I know that during our conversation, you have, so everyone knows, Hilary does have some wonderful images that she's going to share with us this evening. So do you want to access that now?
Yeah. So I'm just going to put on like a looped slideshow of some images and quotes from the book so that you'll get a sense of what we're talking about. And so if you miss it the first time around, it'll be coming back around. And I hope that what I often find in these kind of talks is that you often get serendipity, like we mention something and it comes up as the next slide. So I'm hoping that will happen as well.
I have a feeling it will.
Just, all right. Is that working?
Yeah, it's working on my end. Is everyone okay with it? I think we're good.
Yes, I think it's good.
Cool.
Cool. So Hilary, you have a very diverse and extensive career. I was just wondering, for anyone in our group who's not familiar with your work, if you could just give us a little information about your background and what kind of work you do or anything you're doing now.
Yeah, diverse is the word for it. I have done a lot of things that have all ended up with really looking at the history of textiles and dress. What I'm really interested in is why and how people wear clothes and what it means when they do. But I really started off from a making background. So I've been sewing since I was a child. And I trained as a shoemaker and was doing a lot of, reenactment and costume making. And it sort of got me closer and closer to the academic study of the history of textiles and dress. And then when I finally did a master's in it, it was like, wow, this is great. And my career has been really about that ever since. I'm very interested in material things. So I like objects. I was a museum curator in London for a while. I also work as an archaeologist. All the time, sort of, I still teach and make. So I've got a very broad perspective on dress and textiles, and through that path, I came into the close study of Regency dress, amongst many other things, but really looking at that through the lens of Jane Austen's life and works.
And when did you first become interested in Jane Austen?
Well, I mean, I'd always read the books, but the reason I'm kind of sitting here talking with you today is almost a quirk of fate. It's kind of because of where I studied my master's degree, which is in the town of Winchester in southern England. And as I'm sure many of you know, that's where Jane Austen lived her last days and died, and is buried in the cathedral. And so the Jane Austen's Palace, which is on screen just exactly then, serendipity begins, is held by the Hampshire Cultural Trust. And I knew the curator of the trust at the time, and she asked me if I would reconstruct the palace because I have those skills of remaking. So it was really because I was in the town and I had the ability to remake, because obviously the palace is the only known body garment that has the association of belonging to Jane Austen. And it's very fragile and very popular, because anytime you put a historic object on display, it really stresses the object. It causes damage that you can't necessarily see, light fades it. So they wanted a substitute object, really, that you can put on display instead, but also to do a really close look at the palace and find out if it could have been Jane Austen's, just to see if we could match that up. So oddly, I'd already been given a couple of talks around Hampshire about Dress in the Age of Austen, because she's a very popular figure in her home county. And so then I just became interested in, what did Jane Austen look like? What was her physicality? Because I was really testing it out with this pelisse. And it sort of all just grew from there. But my interest in Jane Austen as a subject of dress history began with her clothing, and really kind of thinking about her as a person and as a woman of her time, and about her physicality.
Now, is there anything when it comes to fashion and Jane Austen that that we might not know, that you've sort of learned and uncovered about Jane herself and her sense of fashion, or the way she gathered her items? Is there anything interesting that you found out, or that we should know about with Jane in regards to fashion?
What I find really interesting about the scholarship around Jane Austen more recently is there's a lot of challenging this sort of notion of the kind of the dear Aunt Jane model, that she was just sequestered in the country and very cloistered and rural and good to her family, and, oh, by the way, wrote 6 genius novels. And lots of scholarship has said, hey, she was far more connected with the world at that time. And I think there's been an image of Austen as kind of being quite dowdy. She took to wearing caps slightly earlier than usual, that she wasn't quite with it. She was dear Aunt Jane. And what I discovered by researching my latest book, Jane Austen's Wardrobe, is that actually she knew what was happening in fashion, and she was interested in it. And especially in her late 20s, in the later 1790s, she was like bang on fashion, and she was aware of it, and she kept up with it. She certainly wasn't a fashion leader, but she definitely wasn't this dowdy country mouse that's too often ascribed to her. She liked clothes. And I really, having spent a long time thinking about Jane Austen, thinking about fashion, I'm convinced that she really enjoyed lovely clothes. And she was always thrifty minded, but you can tell in her letters there is a delight when something is lovely.
Now, is there anything important about the Regency era in particular that you think people that we don't know about, that's something that might be overlooked, or something fascinating that we as modern fashionistas and a modern audience would find interesting that we don't know?
I think it's really important to think about the clothing in terms of the textiles. And we don't tend to do this so much anymore. Our modern views of fashion are really, there's so much about the sort of the style and the way things are put together and the color and the styling. But for 18th century consumers, especially as they move into the 19th century, the fabric itself was kind of half the battle of fashion, and they really understood clothing through touch. The scene in Northanger Abbey where Henry Tilney is talking about muslins, they're talking about the specific qualities of what's essentially a plain woven white cotton cloth. And I think now when we look at Regency fashions over this fascinating time period of great fashionable change, we often tend to look at, say, the fashion plates just on their own, like as images. But if you put them back into the context of the time, they all had textual descriptions with them that said, this is made of this kind of fabric or this kind of silk, and it's a specific color here. And those kind of nuances of quality, of expense, of what was imported, what was locally made, what was kind of a new fashion fabric, they are a dimension that were hugely important to Regency consumers, because Austen didn't have much money. So if something was going to wear well, that was a good buy for her. If something was going to fall apart, clothing cost more, textiles cost more. So you really had to know what's going to wash, what's going to wear, what's going to be pulled apart by dyes, what looks like it's a bargain, but actually doesn't last that long. And to sort of get into that, the lovely qualities of textiles it was important to them, and so it's important to sort of our understanding of it. And the other thing that really was brought home to me by doing this second book, because I have a first book kind of more broadly looking at, called Dress in the Age of Jane Austen, But this book, Jane Austen's Wardrobe, was the importance of really specific developments of the textile, of the Industrial Revolution. So again, we sort of have this like, okay, there's an Industrial Revolution and mechanized production speeds up and, you know, things get faster and textiles get produced more cheaply and quickly. But when you look at it, there's this fantastic kind of competition of who can make a machine that does something a little bit better. And you see this especially in things about machine-made lace. And I realized how closely types of lace garments, not just, oh, this is lace, but this is a double point pressed net lace that comes about in the 1780s. You see that suddenly coming into fashion. And what happens in this incredible period of, you know, change and innovation and, you know, all sorts of like rapid developments, which is why I find the Regency period so fascinating, is that as soon as someone invents a new kind of textile, it's in fashion. And you suddenly see it in the fashion plates, in the portraits, in the objects. And so if we think of it as kind of, I mean, this is going to sound slightly far-fetched, but it's not really in Regency terms. If you think of it in the developments in the internet, web-based technology and smartphones over like the turn of the late 1990s and the early 21st century, and the changes that this technology has brought to society, the textile changes are kind of having a really similar impact in the time. So I've become even more of a textile historian through looking at this and really realizing how important the specifics of cloth were to individual people.
And
I could talk for hours about this.
It perfectly ties into my next question, because as many of us know from the books, we do hear a lot of frequent conversations about muslin in her stories. And I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about this fabric called muslin that we hear so much about. Why was it so important? And I mean, she mentions it a lot in her books. So what is it about muslin?
Well, first of all, I want to make really clear that the muslin that Jane Austen is talking about is not what's called muslin in US English now. The sort of the, you know, natural colored, thick cotton fabric that you use for, you know, making dummy textiles of things. Muslin in the 18th century, 19th century and earlier was a very finely spun and woven white cotton cloth that had originated in India, had been made there for thousands of years from a very specific type of plant that makes a particularly thin thread. And with the, again, this is, you know, Regency fashion ties into the whole history of global politics and trade. It's really fascinating. From the 17th century onward, Britain and the Netherlands formed the British and Dutch East India companies. And they're starting to bring in huge amounts of textile goods and trading between Indian areas and Europe. And one of the things that they bring in is this incredible fabric, which is thought of as woven air. It's so light and transparent, but then it's a real fabric called muslin. And especially in the sort of late 17th century and early to mid 18th century, muslin, this incredibly beautiful light fabric, is a luxury good. It's imported from Indian areas, and people have never seen a fabric like it in cotton. So they use it for sort of small things, neck handkerchiefs and aprons, because it's, you know, it's quite expensive. It's imported. And as we get up into the 1780s, we start seeing more muslin used for actual outer dresses. And this is part of a much bigger revolution of cotton fabrics taking over from linen fabrics. But it starts with this superfine textile. And so in Europe, I mean, particularly in the French court, you have aristocratic women wearing gowns made entirely of muslin. And there's a lot of controversy about this because it looks a bit like underwear. They're sometimes called chemise dresses. And it's a huge contrast with the very, you know, French-made silks and brocades. But this is also an influence from the clothing that's made of muslin, which is the exquisite, luxurious goods of the Mughal courts. So they're kind of imitating Indian area fashions. And from the 1780s, muslin and kind of white cottons that aren't quite as fine as muslin, but imitated well, really start to become the fashion fabric. And into the 1790s, the figure of this sort of white columnar dress made of a cotton fabric, preferably muslin, preferably the genuine Indian muslin, which Henry Tilney knows about, it's the little white dress of Europe, and it's the most popular fashion fabric. So this is causing far more muslin to be imported by the East India Company, which are virtually running India at this time. And they're starting to exert more and more tariffs and controls upon manufacturing in India. But at the same time, European manufacturers, especially the British, are saying, how can we get some of this? How can we get this very lucrative muslin market for ourselves? And so they start making their own muslins, again from the 1780s. And there's this whole competition throughout Austen's day about true Indian muslins and British-made muslins, because the Indian muslins are hand-spun and hand-woven and are actually more beautiful. You can see them in museum collections. And then the British ones are cheaper, but not quite as nice. So you've got this kind of neck and neck competition. Again, this is why Henry Tilney says, and a true Indian muslin, because he's talking about the comparison with the British muslin. And until by sort of about the 1810s, the British start dominating. And the East India Company is doing such terribly nefarious things in India. They're cutting out the muslin market there. And Britain starts selling muslins back to India. So it's, I mean, the whole story is fascinating, and muslins keep being produced in India, but Britain starts to get market share. And this kind of 20 to 30 year period of the 1790s, 1800s, and 1810s, muslin and cotton fabrics revolutionize what fashion can be. Yeah, and it's all about global trade and mutual cultural influence. Is the short, long version of muslin.
That's very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Because I was always curious. I'm always reading about it in the stories. Thank you for explaining that.
Nice. You get also things like the reference in Mansfield Park of, on the one hand, Edmund Bertram says a woman can never be too fine in white, because he's thinking of muslin and appropriate middle-class fabrics. And on the other hand, Mrs. Norris approves of the housekeeper firing housemaids for wearing white, because, you know, it was still a kind of a middle-class luxurious fabric. So Austen's really good about those nuances of, you know, a woman can be too fine in white if she's not of the right social standing.
Mm. So now in the book, you do thank the Jane Austen house and its role for helping you put together things in the book. I was just wondering if you would share what that experience was like.
Oh,
And
they're
what was that
wonderful.
for you?
Everyone at the house has just been so supportive in all the years that I've been researching Austen. And obviously they are the place that has most of the, you know, as many more things relating to Jane Austen than anyone else. And they're just so open and so supportive and said, yep, absolutely, you know, we'll share the research files with you. Yes, you can use the images. And because they're always really interested in sort of knowing more as well about their collections. I've dated some portraits for them. I've looked at the red jacket that was made for Frank Austen, supposedly from Mrs. Austen's wedding, well, traveling riding habit after her wedding. And, you know, I really couldn't have written a book about what Jane Austen wore without the kind of the extremely generous access that they gave me to all of the things there. So it's a great relationship, and I love doing events there for them as a way of kind of offering mutual support.
Fantastic. And were there any Austen discoveries that were your favorite or that you enjoyed finding?
I loved finding out what list shoes are, because I had, so that's a personal one for me. And then I sort of had a slight Austen coup as well. So I'll tell you about both of them if that's all right. There's a reference in Jane Austen's letters that says, oh, you know, I would have stayed longer at the ball, except my list shoes had arrived and I didn't like to keep them waiting in the cold. And I was like, all right, well, these are some sort of slippers that you wear on your way home, and then you but what is list? And I was looking up lots of references that said very helpful things like list shoes are shoes that are made of list. I'm like, great. Anyway, with lots of digging and some help from some shoe experts, I discovered that list is, if you imagine woolen fabric, you're going to make a coat, something like that, and it's got selvages down the edge. And as anyone who makes here might know, selvages are usually sort of thicker and they're under slightly stronger tension, and often you cut them off before you cut the rest of the garment. And list is a fabric woven from the cut off edges of woolen cloth, and then it's just sort of woven over and under, and then people made shoes out of it. And it's a really thrifty way of recycling and using up every scrap of valuable fabric. And so once I sort of realized that, a lot of the references to list I was seeing made more sense. But I was extra excited because in the course of archaeological research, I'd come across this pair of slippers from the 1830s, and they were made of this really weird fabric that I'd never seen before, that was kind of a woolen fabric that was crisscross woven. And I suddenly realized that my two research streams had crossed, and I had these archaeological list slippers and this reference to Jane Austen's list slippers, and it's the same kind of thing. So I was able to publish the list slippers in Jane Austen's wardrobe, and now I know what list is and can tell other people about it, which is very, very satisfying. But the Austen, the other sort of Austen thing that I found is I discovered the location of where Grafton House actually is, because in her letters, the place that she refers to as shopping most is somewhere called Grafton House. And in modern day London, there's only one Grafton Street, which is in Mayfair, just off New Bond Street. And even in the Regency period, as it is now, it's a very expensive, luxurious place to shop. And so Deirdre LaFay, the great editor of Jane Austen's letters, she said, Grafton House was probably Wilding and Kent on the corner of New Bond Street and Grafton Street. And I didn't quite, this snagged at me for a bit, and it didn't quite make sense to me. So I looked and I looked and I looked, and I was like, I was digging for the business and trying to find out where Grafton House was. And eventually I looked at an 1817 map of London, had a sudden brainwave and went, wait a second, there were two Grafton Streets. And the Grafton Street in Soho, which was a much cheaper shopping area that Jane Austen would have known, no longer exists. It's been built over. And once I'd found the second Grafton Street, then I actually found the location of Grafton House at 15 Grafton Street, Soho, not in Mayfair, and all of these other references to it, because it turns out it was a business called Flint and Rays, and they were known for their cheap shopping because they accepted ready money, not credit. So they're a bit like TJ Maxx, like big store, lots of cheap goods, but you had to pay for it on the spot. And that makes much more sense of Austen's references we had to wait half an hour to be served in Grafton House, but then it was really cheap. And so it sort of shifts our understanding of where Jane Austen shopped and how she shopped, just by finding a street that no longer exists. So they're my two favorite things that I found.
Let's see. I was going to say, are there any other parts of your book that you particularly loved putting together?
I just really enjoyed the chance to deep dive into aspects of research, because for my first book, I kind of was looking at men and women in all social classes and across a very sort of broad spectrum of Regency fashion. But for this one, because I was working on quotes from Austen's own letters, which you can see on the way home. So the lace cloak here in 1799, what did a lace cloak mean in 1799? And I could kind of really go down the rabbit hole of trying to find what this might have looked like for Austen at her time. So instead of having like a big broad spectrum, I could really go deep, which historians, we have a slightly obsessive nature and enjoy our rabbit holes. So I really got to enjoy going through that and kind of trying to shake as many references and contexts out of history as I could find.
You mentioned earlier that they brought you on to make a replica of Jane Austen's Police, and that you've done replica work. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience with that?
Well, I can actually share, I'll put this in the chat. I wrote a whole article about Jane Austen's Police, and I'm just gonna, I don't think I can talk and type at the same time, so 2 seconds.
Sure.
Everyone.
No problem.
All right. So for an academic journal, Costume, which is the journal of the Costume Society of Great Britain, I wrote a whole article about reconstructing this police and what I learned from about Jane Austen and her physicality and why I do think it was hers. But I was able to publish this open access. Normally with academic journals, you have to have a subscription, or your institution has to have a subscription, but this one is free for anyone to read. So I will put the link in the chat. And if you are interested in reading more kind of technical details, you can just download this article, which also has a sort of a basic pattern of how Austen's Police is constructed. So if you click on that link there, that will take you through to, I mean, it is an academic article, so it gets a bit academic-ease, but the take home from that is that by looking closely at Austen's Police, and matching it up against descriptions of her physicality, both from herself and other people, it matched really well. She was a tall, thin person, categorically tall for her time, and the Police is made for a tall, thin person with particularly long arms. And one of my most enjoyable kind of research moments, which I don't think I can cite in an academic paper, but it's one of those just personal experiences that gives you a bit of a thrill, was I was talking about the Police in Melbourne in Australia, and I mentioned that the Police has particularly long arms. I mean, I'm 5'9", and I've got correspondingly proportioned arms, and the police arms are too long for me. And so I mentioned this, and it so happened that there was a descendant of the Austen family in the audience. She'd come down through the night side, and she came up to me afterwards and said, "That's really interesting that you said, you know, the Police's owner, I'll call her Jane Austen, had really long arms, because I've always had really long arms, and it's been a bit of a problem my whole life." So we went, okay, I've got the replica Police here, and her arm was too big to get into the sleeve because it's a very slim sleeve, but we measured it against this Austen descendant's arm, and it matched exactly. Her two long arms matched the two long arms of the Police, which is just one of those congruences you can't go looking for, but it was such a pleasure to see.
So what is something that you hope that readers will be able to take away, or that you hope they experience from reading either of your two books?
I really wanted to give people a sense of the reality of the clothing as it was experienced by people at the time. Because one of the things about our perceptions of Regency dress is it's really mediated by costuming. You know, I'm sure most of us come to notions of Regency dress through an adaptation of Jane Austen's work, but costuming is a different thing to the reality of how people wore and experienced clothes at the time. And I get a lot of questions at talks about things like, how did they keep warm? Because we have this sort of endless summer view of, you know, the filmed past, because it's easier to film it when it's sunny and in summer. So I was really interested in things like, how did people keep warm? How did they deal with the realities of bodies and society? And what did clothes mean for them? So I sort of looked at that really broadly in the first book. But for the second book, what I wanted to offer people was another way to look at Jane Austen as a woman of her time and place. And again, one of the wonderful things about Austen and her family is how much they've been researched. So for the first book, I kind of took them as average middle class consumers, which it really turned out they were. Like what the Austens did, a lot of people of their same social station did. And what I'd like for Jane Austen's wardrobe is to kind of, one, provide a source for Austen scholars to go, hey, now we too know what list shoes are, and they don't have to go hunting around for it. But really, for anyone who is interested in Jane Austen and her time, her life, and her writing, to sort of understand the way that she would have seen the world. Because one of the things that I find most fascinating about clothing is that it's a universal human practice. We all do something to our bodies. Usually we put on clothes. So for her to kind of be looking around and inventing these characters, she knew what they looked like in her head. They were dressed people. You know, Elizabeth Bennet isn't running around naked in her head. We know she liked green. That's one of Austen's few comments on her own character's note. Mrs. Bingley liked green, Mrs. Darcy liked yellow. So it's a way of kind of saying, this is what she was seeing around her. This is how she was interacting with her surroundings. And also because, you know, we've got so few verifiable images of Jane Austen, and the only 100% verifiable picture of her, the portrait, the watercolor portrait by Cassandra, it's not a great likeness. So this is a different way to experience Austen's sort of physicality and how she thought about clothes and how she thought about her body in a way that was really important to her. And it was really important to all women, and in fact, you know, most people in her time and place. So I wanted to offer up a different way of seeing and a different way of imagining. And, you know, on a practical level, not just say, you know, Austen scholars, but there's such, there's such popularity for Regency romances, for example. So anything I can contribute to that about, hey, here's what people wore and how they did it, I know that also fuels writers and creatives of all sorts of different kinds. So yeah, offer up new knowledge to be used in whatever way people find, whatever they want to use it.
And I do have to ask, if Jane Austen were in our time, are there any wardrobe staples, designers, anything that you think Jane Austen would be in her wardrobe if she was with us today?
I think, like, my sense of Austen as a consumer is she keeps her finger on fashion. It's more important to her in her 20s, and it starts to fade a bit in her 30s, and especially into her late 30s. She's just a bit less bothered about fashion. She kind of keeps a middle ground of where, like, she keeps in style, but she's also not a style trendsetter, but she doesn't seem to fall behind. So, I mean, there's so many brands in the US that I could be sort of going, oh, she might like this and might like that. But I think she'd sort of be like a happy medium. She'd be putting new things into her wardrobe, maybe avoiding fast fashion purchases because they weren't going to last, going sort of slightly higher quality, potentially a bit preppy. I don't know why I feel that. But she'd be making wise investment purchases, I'd say. All of that, you know, the fashion information we see about buy a trench coat and buy it really well and make sure it lasts, like that's her brown silk pelisse. And she'd be buying well for quality and making sure that she had classics, and then sort of, you know, updating where she needed to.
Thanks. Now, is there anything else that you're working on? Do you have any new exciting projects, books in the works, anything you can share with us?
I'm doing another book, which is going to be a more kind of straightforward guide to Regency dress. That at the moment, that's looking like it's going to come out in fall next year. It's due in about 2 weeks' time, so I'm yet to finish writing it. And yeah, that's sort of that'll make 3 books on Regency dress, and I think I'll stop there for a while. But this one will be really getting into sort of the technicalities of what kind of fabric is lino, and you know, what exactly is an ugly, and what is the difference between a collared neck handkerchief, a chemisette, and a fichu, which I sort of feel mildly confident about saying now. So really getting into the weeds of Regency dress.
Thank you. Rachel, do you have any questions?
Yes, I have a few that were submitted. One question was the dyes that were used on the fabrics. what were the main sources of dyes during Jane Austen's time, and sort of how were they fixed to the fabrics?
It's a sort of, it's an interesting question. It's one I've been asked before. And I looked into dyeing a little bit for this because there's one point where Austen has a dress fall apart. She sends it to be dyed, which is a really common sort of practice of thrift. And when she gets it back, the dress falls apart at a touch. So I was like, what are they doing in the dyeing process that is so terrible? And the works that I could find on dyeing were kind of a bit cowboy, for want of a better word. They were like, well, you sort of do a bit of this and sort of do a bit of that. And this, this gentleman has this recipe using these chemicals and this recipe using these chemicals, but sometimes it doesn't work and we're not quite sure why. And it gave me sort of more of a sense of like, oh, okay, so there's a lot of experimentation. Overall, all dye stuffs at this period, the colorant has to come from natural pigments because synthetic aniline dyes aren't invented until 1856 by young William Perkins, who's actually looking for a cure for malaria. So all of the kind of traditional dye stuffs, indigo, weld, madder, those kind of things, they're being used. But then they're doing a lot more experimentation with things like the mordanting and the fixing to improve the brightness, improve the color fastness, but sometimes it just destroys the fabric of the garment. So I can't say exactly what is being used for mordanting, but there are dyeing manuals of the time, one of which I've quoted in the book, that give an idea of the range of things, and that they're using quite harsh chemicals a lot of the time, as far as I remember. But overall, however they're messing around with them, the colorants come from only natural sources.
And many of us feel that we would love to live in Regent's time, but to give a realistic idea of that, what are the layers of clothing that a female would have been expected to wear in Jane Austen's time?
So you start off with a linen shift. And during this time, the fancy French word chemise comes in and sort of takes over the English words shift and smock. And you can see this sort of turn to Frenchification over the Regency period, especially after the Battle of Waterloo, when it's okay to like French things again, which is 1815. So you start off with linen next to the skin, a kind of a knee-length, short-sleeved tunic. And the purpose of this is to stop most of your clothing touching your body. And this is a washable layer. So it absorbs oils and sweat and skin cells and all of the things that our bodies produce. And then you can chuck it in, also a very harsh washing process. And then over that, you put something to support your bust line. If you have quite a small bust, you might not need something, but most women are putting something over the top to support their busts and also give some kind of shaping. In the 18th century, these are called stays, and they kind of run from the shoulder to the waist. And then in sort of the 1790s, the stays get much softer, and this new kind of French concept of a corset, a little body comes in, and you start to get much, much lighter bust support with less boning. And key thing is that instead of having this kind of monobosom figureheady shape, there's a trend towards sort of a natural body, and you start getting two separate breasts, like in a modern brassiere. And that changes how you cut fabric, because you have to cut very differently for sort of a smooth geometric 18th century shape than for two bumps at the front. So these could be sort of short, these could be long, and you get long stays and short stays and Armenian corsets and divorce corsets and a whole lot of experimentation before they sort of settles about 1820 on the bust to hip mode. But it's really important because you need to create the bust shape in order to make the dresses work. And also, stay makers of the time said it was important for warmth. Having that kind of close fit around your body was important for warmth. You also then need to put on some kind of petticoat. And petticoat is a very confusing word at this time because it really means any kind of skirt. And that can be something, linen worn right over your shift. It can mean a quilted or wool flannel petticoat to keep you warm, or it can mean the splendidly expensive skirt of a court mantua. So petticoat's a very sort of all-encompassing term, but you're going to be wearing at least one of different weights depending on the season. And over that, you put your gown according to times of day. You'll wear a morning dress in the morning. This beautiful cotton fabric is a great example of a morning or day dress, and they tended to have longer sleeves and a higher neck, and then in the evening your décolletage becomes lower, your sleeves become shorter, and then over that, if you're leaving the house, you're putting something on your head, a bonnet, a cap, a hat, something similar. And then there's a huge range of outer coats, wraps, shawls, mantles, redingotes, pelisses, jackets, spencers, cloaks, like these lovely red cloaks here, that you can add in different fabrics. For example, a pelisse could be of the lightest muslin, or it could be fur-lined wool. And then you just alter for the season. Stockings on your legs, which go just above your knee, and shoes on your feet, which have no heels at the time, and they could be boots or they could be shoes. And attentive listeners will realize that I haven't talked about any kind of undergarment between the legs, and they didn't have any. There's no knickers at this point. So the shift does a lot of that work, and at certain times of the month, they seem to have used linen cloths wrapped around like diapers is the closest thing that I've been able to find, and I've been asked this question a lot. So yeah, that's your basic sort of Regency women's wear. But because it's all natural fabrics, it's fairly breathable. Linen's got great moisture wicking properties. It's fairly breathable. And yeah, so you just alter your fabrics, which is again why textiles are so important, according to time of day, time of year, and how much money you have and how much you want to show it off.
Yeah, thank you for that. We do have a few questions about fabric types. So what is bombazine fabric?
Bombazine is either pure silk, but more often mixed cloth woven from silk and worsted. And so there's a difference between wool and worsted. So if you're like, this is what grows on a sheep, right? And you have little short fluffy hairs and longer stiffer hairs, and wool is made from the short fluffy warm ones, and worsted is made from the longer staple ones, and it's a bit harder and harder wearing. So bombazine technically is a silk wool mix, and it's popular for morning, but it's also popular as an evening, dinner, afternoon dress fabric as well.
Okay, thank you. And what is sarcenet?
Sarcenet is a silk fabric. It can be plain woven. It's often twill woven. So there you are. The silk pelisse is woven of a sarcenet, and it can be figured like the pelisse is, which means it has patterns woven into it. But it's an outer gown fabric, so you wouldn't use it for linings or things like that. It's just one of the sort of the weave types that we've lost now. Yeah, but it's an outer garment, nice middle range silk, not ridiculously expensive, but not cheap either.
And then what is pink Persian fabric?
Persian is what you do use on the lining. That is the cheap silk. So Persian it's a plain woven silk. The nearest thing we have to it at the moment is like silk habité, that kind of white, plain woven, slightly dull item. And because it's so cheap and light, it's often used to line garments. So Austen's pelisse is lined in Persian.
That's all the questions that I had, Erin. At this point, if any of our participants would like to put a question in the chat, perhaps you have heard something and you would like a little bit more detail about it. Let's see what we have in our chat. Let's see, we have one question. Is kerseymere a fabric too?
Kerseymere is a fabric, and kerseymere is a new fabric at this point. It's invented in, I'm going to say 1768 by Francis Yarbury. And what it does is it's basically a lightweight warm wool, because these the wool at the time was quite heavy, and he was trying to invent a way to weave wool that would be kind of as light as cashmere. So kersey is a fabric, and then kerseymere became this sort of lighter wool. And what it allows you to do is to have woolen garments that are quite wool, but just not quite so heavy. And it becomes very popular, especially for women's garments.
And can you explain to us what is the surplus gown?
You kind of, the best way to look at that is the page in the book where I explain it, because there's a number of things I think it can be, and I give it my best stab. I think Austen is referring to something that is like the surplus of a priest's robes, so sort of very white and full, but it's sort of confused by, in American English today, a surplus bodice is one that crosses over. So I'm not entirely sure, but that's the picture on the screen is my best guess at what she meant by, there it is, a surplus gown, because it looks like the ecclesiastical robe.
So how do they clean fabrics like wool and silk in Jane
There
Austen?
are fantastic books of household receipts that have all of these kind of recipes for pretty much spot cleaning silk and wool. This is one of the reasons why it was really important to put linen next to your body. And the idea was that, even at the cuffs, the linen is the only thing that touches your body, and it's keeping your silk and wool outer garments from hitting you. So if you get, spots on, you can use Fuller's Earth. You can try and do almost dry cleaning with spirits. Men's clothes were brushed a lot to kind of get particulate dirt out of it. So they did a lot of what we might call dry cleaning now, and were really sort of careful. A lot of things like aprons, they're to protect the silk gown underneath, and they were really thoughtful about the layers that they used to try and make sure that their clothing stayed as clean as possible.
Okay. This one also intrigued me when you were mentioning the corsets, the divorce corset. What is that?
Lift and separate. You divorce the breasts.
Okay. Yep. Makes sense. Makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. The cleavage at the time, it wasn't what I think of as the bread dough together with sort of the line down the middle. The ideal was very much two separate, what I think of as oranges on a plate with a kind of a gap down the middle. So yes, the divorce corset helped that separation.
Oh, okay. Okay. Now this last question is a more personal one for you, Hilary. Since we are representatives from a library, we always like to ask our authors, what part have libraries played in your life currently or in the past? What's your love of libraries?
Libraries are one of my favorite things in the whole world. I have been a dedicated library user since I was a small child. I think I'm currently, last time I counted, I'm a member of 10 different libraries around the world. Libraries are just the most wonderful thing. And I love librarians by extension as well. What is housed in libraries, and that, what you can get to in a public library. That I live in New York and I can just go into the New York Public Library, or when I lived in London, I can go into the British Library, and all of this knowledge is just there and supplied and available and supported, is, I think, one of the most wonderful parts of civilization. And I would not be the person or the scholar that I am without libraries.
Thank you. I think we can all agree about that. Libraries are wonderful. Erin, did you have anything else?
I do not, but I have to admit, tonight's group, you guys put in some really wonderful questions tonight. Thank you for contributing that. No, that was, unless anyone else, Rachel, do you have any other questions?
Let's see. No, that was all that was submitted to me. There's one more question in the chat. What are clocked stockings?
Where you have to turn to make a gusset over the ankle. So you've got bottom of a stocking there, top of a stocking there. You kind of get a decorative bit here. And if you embroider or make a fancy pattern in there, that's called a clock. And then you have clocked stockings.
Wow. That's really neat. I like that. So thank you so much, Hilary. This really was fun. This is really interesting.
And please keep us up to date. Let us know. I know you're working on some more projects, but keep in touch. Let us know what you're working on, and you're always welcome to join us at any of our meetings if you're interested. But we would love to have you back, and we'd love to hear from you again. Thank you so much.
My
Yes,
pleasure.
absolutely. Erin, did you want to tell everyone about the next?
Shall I start
Sure.
sharing? There we are.
Sure.
Yeah, let you do that. And I'm going to share my screen real quick. Okay, can you see that okay, Rachel?
Yes.
Okay, so we do have a fun event coming up on Wednesday, October 9th. We are going to be joined by Melinda Taub. She is the author of the new book, The Scandalous Confessions of Lydia Bennet Witch. But she is also, for any of you out there who know the show The Naked Truth with Samantha Bee, she was the head writer of that show. And she's also an Emmy and award-winning writer, producer. So she will be joining us to talk to us about her first novel, The Scandalous Confessions of Lydia Bennet Witch, on October 9th. I do believe, Rachel, can they register on the website?
Yes, registration is open at this point.
Great. So hopefully you guys, thank you first for joining us this evening and for giving Hilary such a warm, friendly welcome. And hope to see you, wow, on October 9th, pretty soon, to join us for a conversation with Melinda Taub. But thank you everyone for logging on and for joining us. And this was absolutely wonderful. Thank you, Hilary, so much.
My pleasure.
Yes,
Thanks
thank
for having
you.
me.
It was really enjoyable.